Well, I've got good news for you. If you've been pushing your way through this portfolio management reading, you're down to the portfolio management study session topic area, then you're down to the last reading, and it's short, and I joke about it sometimes being content-free. That's not true. It actually deals with some very important stuff, but it deals with it from 20,000 feet, very high-level look. So there's a few basic principles you want to be on top of here. Two things in particular that I want to emphasize, and it's something you can get through quickly. So if you're wondering if you can do one more reading before you nod off to sleep, if there's a reading you can get through, this is probably it. So let's jump in. What we're talking about here for almost all of the reading is essentially an investment policy statement. So you've heard those referred to elsewhere in the curriculum. But when we talk about an investment policy statement, this is the written document that governs all investment management. At least that's the theory behind it. So if you're investing, you have a client, you either discretionary or not, but you're advising, then there should be an investment policy statement involved. And it's going to do a number of things. Starting from the bottom, it's going to identify a benchmark portfolio. So what are we managing this money against? It's going to talk about risks, risk characteristics. The notion here is that it's going to provide some discipline to the client and the manager. So when the client comes in and says, hey, I noticed that commodities were really up last month. How come you didn't have me in commodities? Well, then you pull out the IPS and you say, well, because I'm not supposed to be in commodities, right? And on the other hand, if the manager's looking around and sees that, wow, emerging markets are really raging, well, do you want to, if you've asked this manager to manage something relative to a large cap U.S. Index, then you don't want them running off doing small cap emerging market stuff, right? So it's supposed to impose discipline. It's going to be a clear statement of risk tolerance, and this is actually, these first two are redundant, okay? But the main thing that we're going to talk about is that it identifies objectives and constraints for the portfolio. So it's this written document, and you'll see there's some other stuff that goes in it. Here's the components. Of course, you want a description of the client. Is this a pension fund? Is it an individual? How old are they? How large is the pension fund? Who are the beneficiaries? All those types of things. It's going to give its stated purpose. This is to provide, direction for the portfolio or the portfolio management process. It's going to describe the duties for all the parties that are involved. Also, this is going to have to be updated regularly. If you think back to your ethics material, then it's essentially an ethical responsibility to update this. And what the ethics material says is at least annually, and that the update has to be effective, meaning that you can't just call up your client and say, hey, George, is everything going okay? Sure, wonderful, how are the kids? Anything changed I need to know about? Nope, well, good, we'll talk to you next year. That's not enough, right? It's got to be something that is effective. You've got to have an attempt to resolve any problems that have occurred and make changes based on, whatever it is, corporate secession, birth of a child, an individual, those types of things. So investment guidelines. So this is going to be in sort of what we can invest in, and what the target portfolio is might be included in guidelines. So evaluation of how we're going to evaluate performance relative to the benchmark, how we're going to measure those things are going to be in appendices that will specify a bunch of stuff. Most importantly for our purposes, strategic asset allocation. So we'll give the asset allocation for the bogey portfolio, and then probably say something about tactical deviations and that type of thing. Once again, I left this one out as we went through because I think that this is the main thing that we need to talk about at level one for this reading and to understand what's going on with the IPS. So investment objectives, right? Now, here is the big thing that you have to internalize with objectives, and it's easy enough, but don't forget it, all right? And that is objectives have to be stated in two dimensions, right? There's two dimensions to investment. That is risk and return, right? So we've got to have some idea of what is the risk tolerance of this investor. We'll talk a little more about that, but it's going to be based on ability and willingness, okay? And then something about return objectives, and it can be simply as something stated by the investor, okay? Or it could be driven by, a government regulation. It could be driven by, policyholder capital reserves, all those types of things. But we need to know something about the objectives and something about the risk-taking ability of this for this particular portfolio. So again, objectives have to be stated in two dimensions: risk and return. And then after we get that down, then we're going to look at the constraints that we place on this, all right? So factors affecting investor risk tolerance, well, it might be, psychological factors if we're talking about an individual. So, how old are you? So again, the investment life cycle, you start out, you're accumulating, eventually you're going to retire, live on your nest egg, all those types of things. Of course, if you're an American, you probably don't do that. Americans don't save. But anyway, psychological factors, and then, age, family situation, how close are you to your goals, income levels, that type of stuff. If we're talking, and this is for an individual investor, if we were going to talk about a non-individual investor, we would think about, again, something about regulations that would say, well, how much risk can you take overall? So in the case of thinking like banks and insurance companies, those types of things. So as well as solvency goals or solvency standards for financial firms, those types of things would all factor into risk tolerance stuff. So basically, though, this is going to come down to two things: the ability to bear risk and the willingness to bear risk. So the ability depends on things like investment horizon, how close you are to your goals, what sort of risk management do you have in place, what are your, in a larger sense, your financial responsibilities. Willingness is going to depend on the attitudes, belief about risk, And this, of course, you read this and you think, oh, this is individual, but we also see significant variation in the willingness to bear risk, at least in specific types of risk, between corporate managers in the same industry, right? So the ability and willingness are both going to be important. If you're talking about an individual, well, they may not understand their ability. They generally understand their willingness, but we're going to have to reconcile those, so we're going to talk about that. But anyway, for a corporation or for a larger entity, usually ability and willingness have grown together so that they have a good understanding of that because they've got experts in place to help determine ability and willingness. So if your willingness to bear risk is greater than your ability to bear risk, so this is the, I'm willing to take on lots of risk, but my ability says I shouldn't because I have too short an investment horizon. I'm, a long way from my goals anyway. I've got other responsibilities that could jump up and bite me in the backside, that type of thing. Well, and they're going to tell you that the advisor should go with ability. Okay, this is actually a bit of a change in the curriculum because they used to, this is a pretty direct statement, okay? They used to say, well, there has to be an education process. In the end, it is the client's money, but still clients, if you let a client that doesn't have the ability to take risk, let them take it anyway, even after an education process. When there's bad outcomes, people get sued. So I think they're leaning more towards the notion that if you don't violate the ability constraint, right? Now, if their ability is greater than their willingness, and there's a lot of people like that, so they're already exceeded their goals, they have a long time horizon, whatever it is, but they still want to be in T-bills. Well, there should be some sort of education process, but in the end, it's not your responsibility to try to change the personality or psychological characteristics of individual decision makers. So in this case, you're going to go, again, the willingness will dominate here because if someone's just not willing to take risk, well, you shouldn't be forcing it on them, right? Okay, so that's the idea of objectives. Objectives you have to talk about in terms of risk, which we spend most of our time talking about, but also return, so we need to know what the return goals are. But then we have 5 constraints, right? And this is a formal list. All the IPS statements, or all the investment policy statements should include these 5 factors, and this is something that you should mumble in your sleep. So these are things that you're going to want to know. So we should think about liquidity constraints. So how much cash should we have around? So I'm in my early 50s, and so I'm thinking I'm 10 or more years away from retirement. I have bond-like attributes from my core employment. I'm a university professor, tenured, all that sort of thing. So basically, they got to close the university to fire me, which allows me to be just as incompetent as I want to be. Anyway, so my liquidity needs are low, but as I approach retirement, that's going to change. And as I go into retirement, well, then I'm going to need some cash to fund my current consumption, those types of things. If you're looking at corporations, well, how predictable are their cash inflows? If it's a utility firm, they may not need much in the way of cash. If it is a pharmaceutical, they're going to need a lot more cash because of greater uncertainty in their underlying technology. So anyway, liquidity is going to have to be measured and have reserves there to provide for potential cash outlays. Okay, so legal regulatory. So as an individual investor, I have some legal constraints in the sense of what kinds of accounts I can use and how much money I can put in them. But really that's more taking advantage of opportunities. At the end of the day, I can do most anything I want, okay? So I can put all my money into, futures contracts if I just really am crazy. But if we talk about institutional investors like a life insurance company, well, they've got huge constraints on what they can invest in. Same with banks with all the capital requirement stuff. So legal and regulatory guidelines can be a very binding constraint for a number of entities. Time horizon, well, let's see. Again, we talk about this in terms of individuals, okay? But if you're young, okay, you're still in your 20s or 30s, then you have a very long planning horizon in front of you. As you move into middle age, you're in your 40s and 50s, well, your time horizon shortening. And as you get into your 60s and 70s, of course, you are getting closer to being dead. And that means that the time horizon is being cut even shorter. Well, generally, long time horizon is associated with greater ability to bear risk, right? So knowing something about the time horizon, when we're going to need money, all those types of things is going to be important. Tax concerns. So is this a taxable account? So is it tax deferred like a 401k? Those types of things. Also, it could be non-taxed. It could be a foundation, that type of entity. Then tax concerns would not be important for that particular portfolio. So we got to understand what's going on with the taxes, what the different tax jurisdictions are, tax rates, all that sort of stuff in order to be able to optimize portfolio construction. And then finally, this idea of unique needs. This could be something, and I'll use another example from personal financial planning. That is, if you had a special needs child that would need support beyond your normal life expectancy, then you've got a plan for your retirement and then some cash flows beyond that. Well, that would be a unique need or preference that would need to be considered. And by definition, the unique needs constraint is anything that needs to be considered that doesn't fit into one of the other four categories, right? So so they have four basic things. So legal regulatory, liquidity, legal regulatory, time horizon, tax considerations, and then other is essentially what we see here at the bottom. And those are the 5 constraints that have to be considered in all investment policy statements, all right? So you want to make sure you know the 5 constraints, understand the objectives, then that's really the most important part of understanding what's going on with the IPS. Also, in terms of strategic asset allocation, this is going to be a statement in the IPS about what we're going to do with our money, right? So we're going to look at this in terms of different asset classes. So when you're looking at an asset class, well, the assets that are in that class should be relatively highly correlated. So if you look at large cap equities, well, you choose two randomly selected large cap U.S. equities are going to have a correlation coefficient of 0.3 or 0.4, 0.5, right? Somewhere in there. So it's going to be pretty highly correlated. So within class, you want high correlation. But then between classes, you want low correlation because of the diversification benefits, right? So if you had high correlation between classes, so if you said, I'm going to invest in large cap equities and I'm going to invest in large cap issuer bonds, and those two things had a correlation of 0.7, well, that should probably be one asset class, right? Stocks and bonds from large companies. Now, that's not the way it is, but you want to divide the world so that asset classes have low correlation, assets within the class have high correlation, right? So you can say, I'm allocating this to equity, this to, high yield bonds or whatever the other class is. So this would be an example of a strategic asset allocation. We're going to put a little bit of money in cash, 2%, some large cap U.S. equity exposure of 13, mid cap or small cap U.S. is going to be 8, international equities 12, emerging markets 9, and then you see a bunch of bond allocations, high yield U.S. bond, international bond, a little bit of real estate, and then 6% down here at the hedge funds. So we've looked at this, we've done some back testing on it, we've done whatever our due diligence is. We think we have access to investment, all of these classes are investable for this particular investor, then this would be our statement of strategic asset allocation. We may also allow tactical deviations, right? So if we look at a period where, large cap equities, fall dramatically, so we think, okay, well, they're cycled down. Do we want to increase our allocation slightly at the bottom of the recession? Well, there could be tactical deviations from this. So this is the strategic, okay, with usually some measure for tactical deviation. Okay, and to wrap things up here in terms of portfolio construction, how does it work? Okay, well, it just says let's take all this stuff that we've learned in the last couple of readings and apply it. So we're going to use risk, return, and correlations of the asset classes to construct an efficient frontier, right? Just like we've talked about. So here's the risk and here's the return. And, we're going to use risky assets. We're going to come up with our risk-free rate, and we're going to create our particular CAL, right? And then we're going to look at the investment policy statement. And do we want to be way up here, or do we want to be way down here, or somewhere in the middle, right? So given the ability of this investor to accept risk, well, if we want low risk, we'll be down here. High risk, we're going to be up here. Tactical asset allocation, like I just talked about, that'd be deviations from the strategic, and potentially security selection if we're going to have a manager that thinks that they can pick stocks. Well, that will be, both of those things will be allowed specifically within the IPS, as well as some policy on rebalancing the portfolio. And then we may have some risk budgeting saying, look, you can have these tactical deviations, but if you increase one risky asset category, you've got to do something to offset it if the total standard deviation would exceed some amount. So you can have risk budgeting that allows you to allocate risk into different buckets, and so you can do a little more of something, a little less of something if it doesn't open up too high of a risk overall for the portfolio, those types of things. So all of that's going to be considered in the actual construction of the portfolio. Okay, that is the end of the portfolio management material. I told you that one would be quick. So if we look back, we started out with some very general type stuff that was relatively quick to get through, some risk management issues on a very high level, and then we got into what I thought was the sort of the heart of the matter. That was the portfolio math. We looked at all the variance correlation, put it into a portfolio, come up with the Markowitz frontier, add a risk-free asset, move into capital market theory, compare the SML and the CML, use it for asset selection, all those types of things. So that's sort of the heart of this. And here we've come back full circle and applied it and said, okay, if we're doing this for a client, well, we got to have a way to manage our relationship with the client. That's the IPS. In the IPS, it's going to do a lot of things, and objectives and constraints, as well as some things that are actually going to enable the investment process. So what is our strategic portfolio? How can we deviate from that? When do we rebalance? All that type of stuff. And so we're basically trying to close the loop here on our portfolio material by thinking about how we would actually apply it. Again, I think I told you after the last reading, I think this material is relatively easy to get on top of. It is fairly well contained, meaning that the material contained in the portfolio management topic area is based on really big ideas, and in a multiple choice framework, I don't think you're going to have to come up with the next Nobel Prize winning iteration. So I think that this is, the material is straightforward, fairly easy to understand, and a place where you can pick up some points on exam day. So while it might be a little easy, make sure that you work some problems so that you're sure you're on top of this. And if you do that, I think you're going to be a success in portfolio management. Good luck.